The night stretched wide and cold across the Montana plains, the wind whispering through brittle grass and rattling the loose boards of Samuel Hart's old ranch house. Inside, the sound of a baby crying filled every corner, thin and desperate, a sound that clawed at the heart and refused to let go. Samuel, a man once known for his calm strength, was now hollow-eyed, his shirt wrinkled and stained with milk that had long gone sour. His hands trembled as he rocked his newborn daughter, Grace, back and forth, whispering broken words that even he no longer believed would soothe her. 3 weeks ago, his wife Emily had died bringing Grace into the world. One moment, her laughter had filled the house. The next, the silence of death had taken her place. Since then, Samuel's world had narrowed to a single fragile heartbeat, the baby's. But he didn't know what to do. No matter what bottle he tried, no matter how long he warmed the milk, Grace refused to feed. Her tiny face turned red from crying, her voice raw from hunger. The doctor had said she'd be fine, that it just took time. But time was something Samuel no longer felt he had. He sank into the old rocking chair, pressing the baby to his chest, his eyes stinging with exhaustion. The fire had burned down to embers, and his once strong hands that had built fences, branded cattle, and weathered storms, now shook with helplessness. "Please," he whispered hoarsely, voice cracking. "Please, little one. Just eat." But the cries only grew louder, sharp as splinters in the still night. Across the meadow, through the thin walls of her parents' farmhouse, 19-year-old Clara Brooks heard the same cry. She had been hearing it every night for over a week, each time lasting longer, sounding weaker. The lonely sound reached her like a calling, a plea that wouldn't let her sleep. Clara sat up in bed, her quilt clutched around her shoulders. Her parents had left for the city months ago to find work, leaving her to tend their modest plot of land alone. She'd grown up tough, able to mend fences, milk cows, and bake bread with the skill of someone twice her age. But no amount of hard work could stop her heart from aching at the sound of that baby. She had known Samuel Hart for years, though known wasn't quite the word. He was older, quiet, the kind of man who spoke more to his horses than to people. But everyone in town respected him. When news spread that his wife had died in childbirth, Clara had wanted to go to him, to bring soup or offer help, but her shyness and the gossiping tongues of small towns had held her back. Until now, another wail rose through the wind, weaker this time, almost a sob. Clara threw off her blanket, pulled on her worn boots, and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. The lantern on her table flickered as she lit it, her resolve firming with every step. She knew it wasn't proper for a young unmarried woman to visit a man's house in the dead of night. But mercy didn't follow rules, and neither did love when it began in the heart. The air outside bit cold against her cheeks as she crossed the pasture between their homes. The moonlight gleamed off the wet grass, and in the distance, she could see the faint orange glow of Samuel's window. When she reached his porch, she hesitated only for a moment before knocking softly. The door opened to reveal a man she barely recognized. His face was drawn, his eyes sunken, and his voice was raw when he spoke. "Clara, what are you doing here?" The baby's cries filled the space between them, aching and small. "I heard her," Clara said simply, her eyes glistening, "and I couldn't stay away." That was the moment everything began to change. Samuel Hart stood in the doorway, the faint glow of Clara's lantern spilling into his dim house like a small, stubborn piece of sunlight that refused to die. His first instinct was shame. He hadn't shaved in days. His clothes were rumpled. His kitchen smelled of spoiled milk, and his child, his helpless, hungry child, was still crying in his arms. No man wanted to be seen like that, least of all by a neighbor girl with clear eyes and a kind face. "Clara," he said again, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "You shouldn't be here. It's late." "I know," she replied softly, her breath forming small clouds in the cool air. "But I heard her crying again, and I thought maybe I could help." He wanted to protest, to tell her to go home, that he had everything under control. But they both knew he didn't. His pride wrestled with exhaustion, but exhaustion won. The baby's cries had grown weaker, more desperate. Clara stepped forward before he could speak again, setting her lantern on the table and reaching out gently. "May I?" she asked, motioning toward the baby. Samuel hesitated. The last person who had held Grace besides him had been Emily. The memory struck like a blade, but the baby's crying pierced through his hesitation. He nodded. Clara took the child carefully, her movements sure and instinctive. She cradled Grace against her shoulder, rocking her gently, humming under her breath. The sound was soft and low, a tune Samuel didn't recognize but felt deep in his chest, something that spoke of safety and home. Slowly, almost miraculously, the baby's cries faltered, the little fists unclenched. Grace's eyes fluttered, then closed. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to hum. Samuel stood there frozen, hardly daring to breathe. His shoulders sagged and something in him cracked. She won't eat," he whispered. "She just won't take the bottle. I've tried everything. I don't know what I'm doing wrong." Clara looked around the small kitchen, taking in the cluttered table, the empty bottles, the pot of scorched milk on the stove. She saw the marks of a man who had been trying, really trying, but failing alone. "You're not doing anything wrong," she said gently. "She just misses her mother. Sometimes they can feel that." The words nearly broke him. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Emily always knew what to do. I don't know how to raise a baby. I can't even feed her." His voice cracked. "I thought I could do it on my own, but I can't." Clara didn't answer right away. She just stood there, rocking the baby, watching the man who had always seemed so unshakable come apart in front of her. She'd admired him from afar for years, his steady hands, his quiet strength, but now seeing his weakness, her heart filled not with pity, but with something deeper, tenderness. After a moment, she said softly, "Then don't do it alone." Samuel lifted his head, eyes red and hollow. "Clara, people will talk." "They already do," she said with a faint smile. "Let them. What matters is that she eats and that you rest." There was no defiance in her tone, only calm certainty. She moved around the kitchen, her movements natural, confident. She poured out the spoiled milk, washed the bottles, and started warming a fresh batch. Samuel watched her in silence, every motion she made smoothing the chaos in his mind. When she handed him a clean bottle and guided his hands, showing him how to tilt it just right, how to test the warmth, he followed without question. Grace stirred, suckled weakly, and for the first time in days, fed. Samuel looked up at Clara, eyes wide with gratitude that words could not carry. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled softly, brushing the baby's cheek with her finger. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Hart. No one deserves to face the dark alone." Outside, the wind had quieted. Inside, the baby slept soundly in her crib. And for the first time since Emily's death, Samuel felt the heavy, suffocating stillness of the house begin to lift, and standing by the dying firelight, Clara realized she would come back tomorrow, no matter what anyone said. Morning light crept softly across the valley, washing the ranch in a pale gold glow. Samuel Hart awoke in his chair, the fire nothing but ashes, and for a long moment he didn't remember where he was. Then he heard the faintest sigh, the sound of his daughter, sleeping quietly for the first time in days. His heart clenched. Grace was wrapped snugly in a blanket near the hearth, her tiny chest rising and falling, her lips relaxed in peaceful sleep. Across the room, Clara Brooks stood by the stove, stirring something in a small pot. She turned when she heard him stir. "Good morning," she said gently, her hair loose and shining in the sunlight that filtered through the dusty window. She looked like something out of a memory, warm, calm, sure. Samuel rubbed his face and sat up straighter. I didn't mean to fall asleep," he said, his voice rough. "You needed it," she replied simply, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. She poured a bit of warm milk into a clean bottle and handed it to him. "Try feeding her again, slowly, the way I showed you." He did, and Grace latched on immediately. Her small hands curled around the bottle, and she drank greedily, little sighs escaping between swallows. Samuel stared, almost disbelieving. Clara smiled at the sight, her eyes soft. "See? She just needed a little patience," she said. Samuel let out a long, trembling breath. "I don't know how to thank you. I thought I was losing her." Clara shook her head. "You just needed help, that's all." She turned back to the stove, where bread was baking in the oven. The smell filled the house, real food, real life. Samuel realized how long it had been since his home had smelled like that, since before Emily's laughter had faded from these rooms. Over the next few days, Clara returned without needing to be asked. She brought warm milk, clean linens, and the quiet determination of someone who refused to give up. She tidied the kitchen, scrubbed the counters, mended torn clothes, and hung fresh curtains she'd sewn herself. The ranch, once heavy with grief, began to breathe again. Samuel found himself watching her, not just for the way she cared for Grace, but for the peace she carried with her. She hummed while she worked, sometimes soft lullabies, sometimes old country songs. Her laughter, though rare, lit up the house when it came. Grace responded too, smiling more, fussing less, reaching her tiny hands toward Clara as if she already knew this girl was someone she could trust. Yet Samuel struggled with the feelings building quietly inside him. Every time Clara looked at him with that open kindness, he felt a sharp tug in his chest, a mix of gratitude, guilt, and something more dangerous. Emily's face haunted him in the quiet moments. He could almost hear her voice in the walls, "Don't forget me." One afternoon, Clara found him standing by the old oak crib, a picture of Emily clutched in his hand. Her face, framed by soft curls, smiled back from the photo, young, radiant, full of life. Clara paused in the doorway, unsure if she should speak. "She was beautiful," she said softly. Samuel nodded, his throat tightening. "She was everything good in me. I keep thinking if I move on, if I let anyone else in, it means I'm forgetting her." Clara stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. "You're not forgetting her, Mr. Hart. You're just still living. That's what she'd want, for you and for Grace." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a heartbeat something passed between them, raw, fragile, real. But Samuel quickly turned away, muttering something about needing to check the horses. Clara didn't stop him. She just stood there, watching his shadow disappear through the door, her own heart heavy with emotions she didn't dare name. That night, as she walked home under the starlit sky, she whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for the lonely man who didn't yet know how much he still deserved love. The days began to fold softly into one another, golden mornings, quiet evenings, the slow rhythm of ranch life finding its beat again. Samuel worked the fields, repaired fences, tended cattle. Clara cooked, mended, and watched over Grace. Together, without ever naming it, they built something that felt almost like peace. But beneath the surface, a shadow lingered, one that neither of them dared to touch. It was Emily's presence. She lived in the house like a breath that never quite left. Her dresses still hung in the wardrobe, her books still lined the shelf, her handwriting marked the pantry labels in neat curls. Sometimes, as Clara rocked Grace to sleep, she'd catch sight of a faded shawl draped over a chair and feel an ache, an odd mixture of reverence and guilt. She was stepping into a space that still belonged to someone else. One evening, while Samuel was out fixing a broken fence, Clara was cleaning the nursery. She opened a drawer in the dresser, meaning only to fold away a few things, but instead found a stack of photographs, Emily laughing beside Samuel, her hands resting on a round belly. The joy in those pictures hit Clara like a wave. Emily looked radiant, alive, glowing with the certainty of a love that had once filled this home. Clara set the pictures down, her throat tight. She understood now why Samuel carried that haunted look in his eyes, why he sometimes stared into the fire as if searching for something that wasn't there. She wiped a tear quickly, feeling foolish. This was his wife, the woman he'd built his life with, the woman whose ghost she could never compete against. When Samuel returned, his boots muddy and his shoulders heavy from work, he found Clara sitting quietly in the nursery, the photographs on the table. His steps froze. For a long moment, he said nothing. "I'm sorry," Clara said quickly, rising. "I shouldn't have looked through your things. I was just cleaning." "It's all right," he interrupted, but his voice was tight, almost strangled. He crossed the room slowly and picked up one of the photographs. His thumb brushed over Emily's face, and his expression softened with pain. "That was taken a week before Grace was born. She wanted to name her after my mother." Clara hesitated, watching him. "You loved her very much?" she said quietly. He nodded. "I still do. Every morning I wake up and expect to hear her humming in the kitchen. Every night I think I'll turn and see her beside me. But she's gone." His voice broke on the last word. He set the picture down with trembling hands and turned away. "Sometimes I feel like I'm betraying her just by breathing." Clara took a small step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You're not betraying her, Samuel. You're surviving. That's different." But he shook his head, eyes dark. "You don't understand. When you lose someone like that, you start thinking maybe you're meant to stay in the pain. It's the only thing left that still feels close to them." Her heart ached for him, for the man who had carried too much, who was still trying to live with the weight of love and loss tangled together. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that it was all right to feel, all right to hope again. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded quietly, her voice small. "Then maybe I've stayed too long. Maybe you need space to remember her, without me here?" His head snapped up, eyes wide with alarm. "Clara, that's not what I meant." But she was already backing away, her face pale. "It's all right. I'll still come by to help when you need it, but I shouldn't be here every day. Not if it makes things harder for you." He wanted to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Pride and grief tied his tongue. That night, as Clara walked home under the fading twilight, the air smelled of rain and loss. Behind her, the ranch stood still, its windows glowing faintly, its heart aching with two kinds of love, one gone and one too new to name. Inside, Samuel sat in the dark, the photograph still in his hand, whispering Emily's name, while somewhere deep in his chest, another name began to echo softly beside it. The storm came without warning. By evening, the Montana sky had turned the color of iron, clouds rolling low and fast across the plains. The wind tore through the valley, rattling the barn doors and driving dust against the windows. Samuel Hart had just finished moving the horses to shelter when the first thunder cracked overhead. He was soaked through before he made it back to the house, his coat heavy with rain. Inside, baby Grace was crying again, thin, sharp wails that made his stomach twist with dread. He rushed to the crib and felt her forehead. It was hot, too hot. Panic surged through him. She had been fine that morning, laughing when he lifted her into the air, clutching his finger with her tiny hand. Now her skin burned under his touch. He fumbled with the bottles, the medicine, the blankets. Nothing helped. The fever climbed higher. Grace's cries turned into weak, pitiful whimpers. Samuel tried to think, but his mind was chaos. The doctor lived miles away, and with the roads flooding, there was no way he'd make it to town in time. For one terrible moment, he felt that same hopelessness he'd felt the night Emily died, the same helpless rage at being unable to save the ones he loved. His knees buckled beside the crib. "Please, God," he whispered, his voice raw, "don't take her too." "Not her." Then he thought of Clara. Without another thought, Samuel wrapped Grace in a blanket, pulled on his drenched coat, and mounted his horse. Rain slashed at his face as he rode across the open fields. The sky split with lightning, each flash showing the ghostly outline of the neighbor's farmhouse in the distance. He urged the horse faster, his heart hammering, every breath a prayer. When he reached Clara's door, he could barely knock before she opened it. Eyes wide, lantern in hand, her face pale with alarm. "Samuel?" she gasped, seeing him trembling, soaked, holding the baby close. "What happened?" "She's burning up," he said hoarsely. "Please, Clara, I don't know what to do." She didn't hesitate. She pulled them both inside, shut the door against the storm, and took Grace from his arms. Her movements were swift, sure, born of instinct and love. "Put some wood on the fire," she ordered gently. "We'll need warmth." Samuel obeyed, his hands shaking as he fed logs into the hearth. The room filled with flickering light. Clara pressed a cool cloth to Grace's forehead, then mixed herbs and water from the stove. "My mother used to treat fever like this," she murmured, half to herself. "It draws the heat out slowly." Hours passed. The rain pounded the roof, the thunder rumbled, but inside the little farmhouse, there was only the steady rhythm of care. Clara never left the baby's side. She rocked, she whispered. She sang lullabies between her prayers. Samuel sat by the fire, head bowed, his heart breaking open at the sight. At one point, he looked up and saw Clara's hair clinging to her face, her eyes red with exhaustion, her lips moving in silent prayer as she held the child close. Something inside him shifted, something deep and irrevocable. It wasn't just gratitude. It was love, fierce and undeniable, growing like fire in the ashes of grief. Near dawn, the storm began to fade. The rain slowed to a whisper. Clara placed her hand gently on Grace's cheek, then smiled, soft, tired, but radiant. "She's cooler," she whispered. "The fever's breaking." Samuel exhaled a shuddering breath, tears stinging his eyes. "You saved her," he said. Clara shook her head. "No, love did." Grace let out a tiny sigh and fell into peaceful sleep. The storm outside finally stilled, replaced by birdsong, faint and new. Samuel looked at Clara, her face glowing in the amber light, and something in his chest unclenched for the first time in months. When the morning sun broke through the clouds, Samuel Hart realized that sometimes salvation didn't come from prayers alone. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a neighbor girl with trembling hands, a merciful heart, and the courage to face the storm. When Samuel awoke, the storm had passed. A pale light spread across Clara's farmhouse, filtering through the curtains and painting everything gold. The smell of rain lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of milk and lavender. He blinked, realizing he'd fallen asleep by the fire, something he hadn't done in years without waking in panic. Grace lay peacefully in her makeshift cradle near the hearth, her small chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The fever had broken. Her cheeks were pink again. Samuel felt an ache in his throat as he reached out to touch her forehead. Cool, safe, alive. Then his eyes moved to Clara. She was asleep in the rocking chair, still in her dress from the night before, her hair loose and tangled, one hand resting on the baby's blanket as if afraid to let go. She looked exhausted but beautiful, the kind of beauty that came from goodness, not perfection. Samuel sat quietly, afraid to disturb the fragile peace. He just watched her, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the rhythmic drip of rain from the roof. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt alive. He stood, stretching stiff muscles, and moved to the kitchen. The least he could do was make breakfast. His movements were awkward at first. He wasn't used to the rhythm of another person in the house, but he found himself humming under his breath as he worked. He fried eggs, brewed coffee, and even cut a small bouquet of wildflowers that had survived the storm, setting them in a jar on the table. When Clara stirred awake, blinking in confusion, she saw Samuel standing there with 2 plates and a shy, uncertain smile. "Morning," he said softly. "I figured you deserved more than cold bread after saving both our lives." Clara rubbed her eyes, smiling sleepily. "You cooked?" "Something like that," he chuckled. "Don't hold me to the standard you've set." She laughed, a sound so light and warm it filled the little house. She joined him at the table, her cheeks flushed. They ate quietly at first, the kind of silence that felt safe, comfortable. Grace slept nearby, a reminder of the miracle they'd just come through together. After breakfast, Clara went outside to hang wet blankets on the line. The world sparkled, raindrops clinging to grass, sunlight breaking through the clouds in long golden beams. The storm had washed everything clean. Samuel joined her, handing her the clothespins, and for a while they worked side by side in wordless rhythm. When they finished, he turned to her. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "I don't know how to thank you. You stayed up all night, you risked yourself in that storm. I don't think Grace or I would still be here if not for you." She looked up at him, eyes soft. You don't owe me thanks. I just did what anyone would have done. No, he said quietly. Not anyone. You. The way he said it made her heartbeat stumble. She looked down quickly, pretending to adjust a blanket on the line. Well, she murmured, I couldn't let her suffer. Or you, he smiled faintly. You've brought more than help, Clara. You've brought life back to this place. Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him that he'd brought something back in her, too, that his quiet strength and his baby's laughter had filled a loneliness she hadn't even realized had grown inside her. But she didn't. She only nodded. Over the following weeks, Samuel asked her to stay on at the ranch, just until Grace is stronger, he'd said. But both knew it had become more than that. Clara became part of the rhythm of their days. She fed the animals, cooked their meals, and sang Grace to sleep each night while Samuel watched from the doorway, heart full and aching. One evening, as the sun sank low over the fields, Samuel lifted Grace into his arms and said softly, She smiles more now. Clara looked up from the porch steps, her voice tender. That's because she feels loved, Samuel hesitated, then whispered, So do I. Clara's eyes met his, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. The new dawn that had broken over the ranch wasn't just the light of morning. It was the beginning of healing, of hope, of a love neither had expected but both quietly needed. By the time summer rolled over the Montana Valley, the Hart Ranch had come alive again. The fences were mended, the fields green, and the baby's laughter could be heard from the porch nearly every morning. Samuel often found himself smiling without realizing it, something he hadn't done in months. Clara's presence had turned the house from a place of mourning into a home once more. She moved about easily now, as though she had always belonged there. She fed the chickens before sunrise, sang softly to Grace as she washed dishes, and joined Samuel in the fields, handing him tools and teasing him for his stubborn ways. It was a quiet, unspoken partnership, two hearts working in rhythm, both unaware of just how close they'd grown, but small towns, with all their charm, held sharp tongues. At first, it was only curious glances in the general store. Then came the whispers, low, quick, but cutting. That young Brooks girl living under the same roof as a widower? No chaperone, no family, just her and him and that baby? Folks began to talk more boldly, their gossip twisting what was pure into something scandalous. Clara heard it one morning when she went into town for supplies. She was standing at the counter of the mercantile when Mrs. Granger, the preacher's wife, lowered her voice just enough for everyone to hear. A shame, isn't it? She said to another woman. That poor Mr. Hart, barely cold in his grief, and already that girl set herself up in his house. Folks ought to have some decency. The words struck like a slap. Clara stood frozen, her cheeks burning. She turned and met Mrs. Granger's eyes for a moment, but the older woman only raised her chin higher, self-righteous and unflinching. Clara paid for her groceries with trembling hands and walked out into the sunlight, her heart heavy. She had done nothing wrong, she knew that. But shame didn't always need truth to take root. When she returned to the ranch, Samuel noticed the stiffness in her shoulders immediately. You all right? He asked, setting down the hammer he'd been using to fix a gate. I'm fine, she said too quickly. Then, after a pause, Samuel, what do people in town say about me? He frowned. What people say doesn't matter. But they're saying things, she pressed, her voice shaking. That I shouldn't be here. That it isn't proper. Samuel's jaw tightened. They don't know what they're talking about. You've done nothing but good for Grace. For me? Clara looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. It doesn't matter what's true. You know how people are, and I can't let their talk hurt your name, or Grace's. He stepped forward, his voice rough. Clara, you're not leaving because of gossip. She met his gaze, her voice small but firm. I think I have to. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of the wind through the trees filled the space between them, heavy with all the words they couldn't say. Samuel wanted to tell her she belonged there, that she was the light that had pulled him from darkness. But pride, fear, and confusion tangled in his chest. That evening, Clara packed her few belongings, a shawl, a couple of dresses, a small wooden cross that had belonged to her mother. She moved quietly, her heart breaking with every fold. Grace slept peacefully in her crib, unaware that the woman who had become her second mother was about to leave. Samuel stood in the doorway, hands clenched at his sides. "If you walk away now," he said softly, "I don't know if I can forgive myself." Clara turned, tears slipping down her cheeks. "There's nothing to forgive. I just want to protect you." She pressed a kiss to Grace's forehead, whispering, "Be good for your papa," and walked out into the dusk. The sound of her footsteps faded down the dirt path, leaving Samuel alone in the doorway, the baby's soft breathing the only sound in the empty house. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the ranch that had begun to bloom once more fell silent again, its heart gone walking down the road. The weeks after Clara's departure felt longer than any winter Samuel had ever endured. The ranch, once alive with quiet laughter and the sweet hum of her voice, had grown hollow again. Even the wind seemed lonelier, whispering through the eaves where she used to hang Grace's blankets to dry. Samuel tried to bury himself in work. He mended fences, broke horses, planted new seed, anything to exhaust his body enough to silence his mind. But every time he came back to the house, it was the same. A cold stove, an empty chair, and the faint scent of lavender still lingering in the baby's room. Grace noticed the absence, too. She fussed more now, refusing bottles, crying herself to sleep in a way she hadn't since the night Clara first came. Samuel would rock her in his arms, murmuring softly, but nothing soothed her for long. One night, when her tiny cries broke into sobs, he sank to the floor beside her crib, whispering hoarsely, "I know, sweetheart. I miss her too." Meanwhile, in the small town on the other side of the ridge, Clara tried to rebuild her own quiet life. She took up work at the schoolhouse again, teaching letters to the children and pretending she didn't feel hollow inside. Every night she'd light a candle and sit by the window, staring toward the mountains, wondering if Samuel and Grace were all right. But the gossip hadn't stopped. It had only shifted tone. Now folks said she'd come to her senses and done the right thing. Each comment felt like a small betrayal of what her heart knew to be true. She hadn't left because it was right. She'd left because she was scared. Scared that her love for that rancher and his child would bring ruin upon them both. Then one morning, a knock came at her door. When she opened it, she found Samuel standing there, hat in hand, his face lined with exhaustion and something deeper. Hurt. Samuel... Her breath caught. He nodded once. "Morning, Clara." His voice was low, rough from sleepless nights. "Didn't mean to startle you." She stepped aside, letting him in, her heart pounding. The sight of him filled her with warmth and sorrow all at once. He looked around the small room. Plain, tidy, but lifeless. "You've been all right?" "As well as I can be," she said softly. "And Grace?" "She's growing," he said. "But she cries more now. I think she misses you." He paused. "I know I do." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy. Clara swallowed hard. "Samuel, I never meant to hurt you. I thought it was best." He shook his head. "Best for who? For people who don't know us? Don't know what we've been through?" His voice broke slightly. "Clara, I've lived through storms and death and loneliness, but nothing's felt emptier than these last weeks without you." Tears welled in her eyes. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," he interrupted, stepping closer. "You belong with us. With Grace. With me." Clara trembled, her heart torn between longing and fear. "If I come back, they'll talk again." "Let them," he said firmly. "I don't care what they say. I care about my family. And you're part of it, whether you believe it or not." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the small clock on her mantel. Then Clara took a shaky breath, meeting his eyes. "I can't keep running from kindness," she whispered. "From love." Samuel's expression softened, and for the first time in weeks, a small smile touched his lips. "Then come home, Clara." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. He reached for her hand, rough and calloused from work, and she took it. feeling the strength in his grasp. The same strength that had once pulled her from the storm, now pulling her from her own fear. When they rode back to the ranch that afternoon, Grace saw Clara from the porch and let out a delighted squeal. The sound of her laughter filled the valley like sunlight breaking through clouds, and as Clara lifted the child into her arms, Samuel watched them both, knowing that this peace, this warmth, was worth facing the world for. The distance between them had finally closed. The ride back to the ranch was quiet but full of meaning. Clara sat beside Samuel in the wagon, her hands folded in her lap, heart fluttering like a trapped bird. Every turn of the wheels brought her closer to the place she'd tried to forget, and the man she could no longer deny loving. When the ranch came into view, a soft gasp escaped her. It looked different somehow, warmer, alive again. The windows gleamed in the sunlight, the fences straight and strong, the fields green from summer rain. But more than that, it felt right. As if it had been waiting for her, Grace spotted them first. She was sitting in her cradle on the porch, watched over by the neighbor's teenage son who'd been helping Samuel since Clara left. The moment the baby saw her, she squealed in delight, tiny arms flailing. Clara laughed, tears spilling down her cheeks as she rushed forward and scooped Grace into her arms. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing her face to the baby's soft hair. "Did you miss me?" Grace giggled and patted her cheek, as if answering yes 1,000 times. Samuel stood behind them, hat in hand, watching the two people he loved most in the world reunited. The sight filled something in him that had been empty for too long. Over the next few days, life slowly settled back into its old rhythm, though it wasn't quite the same. There was a tenderness now that hadn't been there before, a quiet understanding in every glance they shared. When Clara cooked, Samuel would find excuses to linger nearby, handing her things she didn't ask for. When he worked outside, she'd bring him water and linger too, pretending to check the garden, but really just wanting to be near him. They didn't speak of love, not yet, but it was there, pulsing softly in every smile, every shared laugh, every quiet evening by the fire when Grace slept between them. Of course, word spread fast that Clara had returned. The town's gossip mill churned again, sharper this time. Mrs. Granger and her circle whispered that sin had settled over the Hart place and that the preacher ought to have a word with them. But Samuel and Clara had both changed since the first time. They didn't hide anymore. When they rode into town together one Saturday, Samuel, holding Grace in his arms, and Clara, sitting beside him in the wagon, every head turned. The blacksmith paused mid-swing. The storekeeper stepped out onto the porch, and Mrs. Granger herself froze at the sight. Clara felt their eyes like a weight on her shoulders, but she kept her chin high. Samuel glanced down at her, saw the nervousness flicker across her face, and gently took her hand. Right there in front of everyone, that simple act silenced the whispers. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The message was clear. She was his family, his choice, his heart. Inside the general store, they went about their errands as if nothing were unusual. Clara bought flour and sewing thread. Samuel picked up nails and feed. Grace babbled happily in his arms, completely oblivious to the tension around them. And when they left, heads still turned, but the tone of the murmurs had changed. Some even smiled, quietly, almost approvingly. By the time they returned home, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. She turned to Samuel as they unloaded the wagon. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied. "I should have done it long ago," she smiled, her eyes bright. "You know this means they'll talk even more." He shrugged, a faint grin tugging at his mouth. "Let 'em. They'll get tired of talking before I ever get tired of you." Clara blushed, laughter mixing with tears. She reached out and touched his arm lightly. "You're not tired of me yet, then?" He met her gaze, steady and warm. Not even close. That evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the fields to gold, they sat together on the porch, Samuel, Clara, and baby Grace between them. The air smelled of hay and honeysuckle. The world was quiet, content. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like an outsider. She wasn't the neighbor girl anymore. She was home. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew that what had begun as an act of mercy had become something far greater, something that could finally stand, unafraid in the open light of day. Autumn came softly to the valley, brushing the fields in gold and copper. The mornings turned crisp, and the scent of applewood smoke lingered in the air. On the Hart Ranch, life had found a rhythm again, steady, warm, and full. Clara woke early each day to the sound of Grace's laughter echoing through the house. Samuel would already be outside by then, feeding the horses, his deep voice carrying faintly through the open window as he hummed to himself. Sometimes she'd pause in the doorway just to watch him, the way the sunrise caught his shoulders, the quiet strength in his movements, the peace that had settled over him since she returned. There was love in everything they did now, though still unspoken. In the way Samuel took Grace so Clara could rest, in the way Clara left biscuits wrapped in a napkin on the fence post for him when he worked late. Love had woven itself into their days, gentle and sure, but even happiness can carry unspoken fear. One evening, after dinner, Samuel sat on the porch with Grace asleep in his arms. Clara joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The stars were just beginning to appear, bright and cold above the wide Montana sky. "She's growing fast," Clara said softly, looking at the baby's peaceful face. Samuel nodded. "She'll be walking soon." "Talking too. You'll have to teach her letters. She listens to you better than anyone." Clara smiled. "Maybe because she knows I'll give her cookies afterward." He chuckled, then fell quiet, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "Clara, can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated, as though weighing every word. "When you left, I realized something. This ranch, it's just land and fences without you. Grace smiles more when you're near. And I breathe easier." Clara's heart beat faster. "Samuel?" He turned toward her, his eyes steady but filled with vulnerability. "You've given us both more than I could ever repay. But I don't want you here because of duty. I want you here because you want to be. Because you belong," tears stung her eyes. "I do want to be here," she whispered. "You know that." He reached into his pocket then, pulling out a small ring, simple silver, worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "She used to say a home isn't built from wood or stone, it's built from love and faith. I lost both for a while, until you walked through that storm to my door." Clara stared at the ring, her breath catching. "I know this isn't fancy," he said. "But I'm not asking for fancy. I'm asking for forever. Clara Brooks, will you marry me?" Her hand flew to her mouth. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. The night was so still she could hear her own heartbeat. Then she nodded, tears spilling freely. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, Samuel, yes," he smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes and slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he leaned forward, kissing her softly beneath the stars. Grace stirred in his arms, cooing as if in approval, and they both laughed through their tears. Word of their engagement spread quickly through town, but this time the whispers held a different tone. People had seen the way Samuel looked at her, the way Clara had brought life back to the ranch, and even the harshest tongues softened. The preacher himself came out one Sunday and married them beneath the oak tree near the house, the same tree that shaded the porch where Clara had first fed a starving baby. As vows were spoken, the wind rustled through the branches, and the baby's laughter rang like music through the fields. When it was over, Samuel took Clara's hand, his thumb brushing the silver ring that now gleamed in the sunlight. "You saved us," he murmured. She smiled, eyes shining. "No, Samuel. We saved each other." And so the ranch that had once known only grief found new life. The widowed rancher, his baby, and the neighbor girl who had come with nothing but mercy in her heart, together they built a home filled with love, laughter, and the quiet strength of second chances. Under the endless Montana sky, their story, born of hunger, healed by kindness, and sealed with love, finally came full circle.